right. So, like I said, we talked about, monetary policy. We talked about fiscal policy, right? And how, just like with a trade deficit, if we're exporting more than we're importing, we have a surplus. If we're exporting less than we're importing, we have a deficit. So, similar thing with the government. If we have more revenues than we're spending, we're in a surplus. And if we have less revenues than we're spending, we're in a deficit. And like I said, we've been in a deficit for a long time. There's a variety of reasons about that, and we will talk about that in greater detail when we get to that chapter. But we had a primer, right? Of there are three types of policy, right? So we had the monetary, we had the fiscal. So the monetary having to do with interest rates and the central banks, fiscal having to do with the government and their spending, right? And the last one that we didn't get a chance to talk about that we'll talk about right now is the structural policy. So the structural policy, right? And so what are structural policies? Well, these are policies aimed at, kind of the underlying it says structure, but I'm going to use a different word, right? The kind of cogs in the, economic machine. If we want to think about it like that. Why not? So, this is really aimed at, our structural policies influence / determine those things called institutions, which, I talked to you guys about, right? When we think of institutions, we think about, an institution of higher learning or a mental institution or whatever, or like a nonprofit, could be an institution. Well, no, we're talking more generally here. We're talking about, institutions is, the norms. It's not just the laws and stuff, but it's the norms, the kind of, the ease or difficulty of doing business. So, because in some places, right, that like it's just taken as a thing. Oh, perfect. Go ahead and submit it. Yay! That's a great email I just got. So a lot of times, it's just taken as a given that you have to maybe bribe somebody, right? Or that you might need to wait a long time in order to get your business thing approved or whatever, right? Or, there might be contract law in that particular country, but if it takes 4 years for you to get something up to the courts, or like 10 years, I think in India, they were backlogged like 10 years or something, right? So what the heck's the point of going through all that work and getting a contract? Just, you can't enforce it. It's going to cost way too much time and money, and by the time you enforce it, you're not going to end up actually getting much value from that deal, right? So these, all of these things, the delay in which it takes to bring, contract cases up to courts and the ease of that and so on and so forth, right? This is all answering this question of what should an economy look like? And so again, when we talk about what an economy should look like, well, what are we really talking about? We're talking about positive versus normative economic statements or analyses. So when we talk about positive analysis, right? This positive analysis, we defined this earlier, but we'll do it again. This is talking about, just the consequences. What are the consequences? What are the causes or consequences, actually? What are the causes or consequences of a particular event, policy kind of thing, right? So this does not it never judges if those changes are desirable, right? If they're good or bad. That is where our normative analysis comes into play. I should probably do a slideshow if I want to do that. Boom. Our normative analysis is talking about whether a policy should be used. So should we use this policy? So this inevitably it brings in the person's values, right? So it's inevitably subjective. You know, we can sit here and debate all day, and that's really where the politics part of the political economy comes in, right? We can sit here and debate all day about which policy we should pursue, but a lot of times we can agree the causes or consequences of a particular problem or even a particular policy. So what do we do in macroeconomics, right? What's the main kind of name of the game? So the main thing in macro is this weird word that we're not used to, but it's aggregation. And it just means I'm taking all the stuff and I'm adding it all up together. So this is the adding up of individual economic variables so that I can obtain economy-wide totals. So, you know, there are some advantages to aggregation, there are some disadvantages to aggregation, right? We have to kind of assume that, you know, there's a typical kind of person in terms of the typical consumption or the typical work that they do or the typical education that they do, right? And so we actually, you know, there's a lot of heterogeneity, there's a lot of differences, right, in the population and in the different economic events or economic variables, right? And so those differences kind of put a bit of a wrench in this method of aggregation, but it's really the best thing that we have. So it's the best thing for taking a bird's eye of the economy, right? That bird's eye view. Seeing the forest rather than the trees. Bird's eye view. So one of the big problems that we have in economics, right, is how do you, combine, a bushel of wheat or something like that and a new computer or a new phone or a month's worth of internet, right? And so aggregation, it's measured in dollar values, right? So that we can do apples to apples kind of comparisons. However, like I said before, aggregation, it's not perfect, right? It often obscures the fine detail of an economic situation. So what are some of the examples of aggregates that we typically see? Well, crime rates, right? Crime is an individual thing that happens, but we have crime rates that says, per 100,000 people or whatever, this is how many homicides, robberies, assaults, yada, 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 right? Similar thing, well, not necessarily that similar, but unemployment rates, right? Unemployment is an individual thing. Either individual to you or individual to the business, right? But, we aggregate all of that up. So we talk about the unemployment rate of the economy as a whole, or of the labor force as a whole. And then the last one, right, we've already kind of talked about this, right, is that output per worker. So the labor productivity, right, that's also known as the labor productivity. So this is, looking at all the individual labor productivities, which differ from worker to worker, right, and adding them all up over time. So, any questions on chapter 4? Excellent. Moving on to chapter 5. So we won't go too much into chapter 5, seeing as a third of the class is gone, but we'll start. So chapter 5 is all about economic activity, right? And the thing that we're going to learn about right now is this term GDP. So GDP, what the heck is that, right? Why is that in the title of the chapter? I don't even know what it is. Well, it stands for gross domestic product. And so each one of these words has a different meaning and, is really specifying what's going on here. So the gross it's not, so when we think of gross, it's like an accounting term, there's gross and then there's net, right? The gross cost of something, and then the net cost of it is the price of it minus any individual inputs, right? So this is just the final value. So that's what this gross is really telling us, right? The final value. This domestic is talking about, things produced in the United States. We're talking about the U.S.'s gross domestic product here, right? And then product, this is talking about, goods and services. So it's not just gross domestic good, it's gross domestic goods and services. And so this formal definition here of gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country at a given time. Well, in a given period of time. So this has to have a period, right? There's no GDP of this moment right now. There's a GDP of the last day. There's a GDP of the last year. There will be a GDP of the next year or the next day. But it's over a given period of time. And it's all final goods and services, right? Final goods and services. So what does this mean? This means that I am not counting. So I'm ignoring all intermediate inputs. And so the reason why I'm doing this is so that I can avoid double counting. So we've already got the full value of that final good and service. If we were to go ahead and add up, so let's just talk about a simple birdhouse or something, right? You buy all this wood and stuff and screws at Home Depot, $5 for this birdhouse. You sell the birdhouse for $20. We're not going to add $25 to GDP. We only add the $20. So we don't double count that $5 of input costs or intermediate costs. So let's go ahead and do an example, right? These things are often best when we do an example here. So let's do an example of a really simple economy, right? So we've got an economy, and it's got apples, bananas, and shoes. That's it. And we are told that each one of these things has a established price. Apples are a quarter, so they're 25. I guess I could have done 25 cents. Cents a bit harder. Bananas are 50 cents. And shoes are $20. And then we're given a certain amount of demand. We're told over a week or over whatever, right? We're not actually told in this, but we have to have some sort of period of time. So we're, given, let's just say, over a month. There's a quantity demanded. For each one of these things, we've got 4 apples demanded. We've got 6 bananas demanded, and we've got 3 pairs of shoes demanded. So go ahead on your own, do this mind tingler. You could probably do it in your head, right? What is the full GDP of this apple banana shoe economy? Orchadia is what they call it. Orchadia. Which, is not inclusive of the shoes, but whatever. So in order to do this, we would just go ahead and we would multiply the amount of money, the price of it, right? So this is our price over here, and this is our quantity. And so we're just going to multiply them together, so we get $1 of a GDP contribution from the ooples. We get $3 from the bananas, and we get $60 from the shoeses. So the full GDP of Orchadia is $64. We literally just add up all of these things together. It's that simple. So since we were looking at not just the demanded, so the demanded is also the sold, right? And what's sold? What's another word for sold? Expenditure. So there's actually 2 different ways for us to calculate the GDP. One of them is based on the output. The other one is based on the, one of them is based on the output. The other one is based on the input. Yeah. So there's income-based, expenditure-based. So we are learning the expenditure-based. So, by far, this is not a perfect measure of what's going on in the economy, right? Why are we doing this? at the end of the day. Well, we really had no idea what was going on before World War II, right? And that's part of why the Great Depression hit us so hard, is that we didn't take any of these. You know how like you go to the hospital, they take your pulse, they take your blood pressure, right? The vital signs. We never did any of that stuff before. So we had to develop what they were. And so, these unemployment, the value of stocks, the different prices, right? What's going on with these prices? All of these things are vital signs of the economy that the government, different investors, business people monitor for their, either their job or just for their own self gain. But again, this is not, it's not perfect, right? So why is it not perfect? Well, there's some non-market goods that aren't included. So, so childcare, a lot of the cooking and cleaning that happens at home. All of these are economic production that, you could pay somebody for childcare, you could pay somebody to be a nanny, that would be part of GDP, but if you're doing it yourself, it's not. You could pay to have a chef and to have a maid, that would be part of GDP, but if you do it yourself, then it's not. So all of this non-market stuff is not included. The other thing is, a large chunk of our economy is government spending. Now, most of that is military spending, but that's a whole other topic we'll talk about another day. Now, if we discount military spending and think about the other stuff, these goods have value, right? Government goods and services provided have value, but no price, right? We know the quantity. The quantity demanded or the quantity supplied, but we have no idea what to price them. And so what do they end up doing? They end up valuing them at cost. So however much it costs them. And if there's waste and inefficiency in our government, which there definitely is, then this cost accounting convention overstates the GDP. So when we're talking about GDP, we are talking about final goods and services. And we don't include intermediate goods and services used in the production of the final goods and services, right? So while we don't include used up intermediate goods and services. Final goods can be intermediate, like so capital goods. There are also intermediate goods or intermediate inputs that are not used, right? So they're not used up. They're long-lived. That are counted as part of GDP. So, you know, these things, these long-lived intermediate goods, we define them to be capital goods. It's a long-lived good used in the production of other So, you know, houses, apartments, motels. Stoves in restaurants, not in your house, but in restaurants. Or in a cooking school, right? Your laptop. Delivery vehicles. And the important thing for us to remember here, that's very easy for us to get confused, is to think about, well, I've invested money into the stock market, so I created capital. No. Money is not a capital good. Money is a means of conveyance, right? It's a means of which one person can loan another person, and then that person can then invest in a capital good. But money itself is not a capital good at all. So let's define it. The full thing. GDP is represented by Y, and it's broken down into the following parts. We have consumption, we have investment, we have government purchases, and then lastly, we have net exports. Gesundheit. So, what are each one of these things? Well, let's go through a few and then call it a day. So, consumption expenditure. This is all the spending by households for goods and services. this can be broken down into a few different categories. We've got durables, non-durables, and services. So durables are long-lived consumer goods, right? So this is going to be, you know, your cars, your furniture, your TV, your microwave, Gesundheit. Non-durables, well, that's going to be all the stuff that has a shorter shelf life, right? So this is going to be, you know, clothing, food, and then bedding. Hopefully, right? Gross. And then services are the largest component. And services, you know, you're sitting in one right now, right? Education, you're getting your hair cut, any kind of healthcare stuff, you know, when you get an Uber or a Lyft. All those things are services. Questions on consumption expenditures. Pretty straightforward. All right, investment. Now we're going to start to get a little bit trickier. So investment is spending by firms. And, you know, businesses' fixed investment is when they purchase new capital goods such as, you know, if they expand the amount of property that they have. You know, if they do an expansion. If they buy some more equipment. Residential investing is the construction of new homes and apartment buildings, not the sale of old homes. So also part of investment is residential investment. But it's only new homes. Only new homes, apartments, townhouses, all that kind of crap, right? It's only new. So if you sell a used house, it doesn't add to any investment. And then the last one, which is probably the most annoying one, is inventory investment. So any crap that you didn't sell that you produced last year, you can call it investment. So this is the change in unsold goods. And you guessed it, the company's inventory. So, you know, these are goods, not really services, just goods. Produced but not yet sold. And just kind of so you know, later this can be negative as well as positive. So we'll go through some examples of that. All right, and so because I think it's a really important thing, we're going to stop and pick up here. And I'm going to send a video out too that it's a little bit out there in terms of, you know, it's it's by this like Marxist scholar guy, you know what I mean? So he's talking about the crisis of capitalism. But when we're talking about investment and we're talking about expansion and stuff like that, he does a really, really great job, like using a monopoly board, of explaining the process of capitalism and capital accumulation. So I'll send that out, and I'll just link to the time where I want you guys to start watching it, and then we'll pick up from here in class on Monday. All right, guys, have a great weekend.